Thanks to all of you for your patience and for joining Tevora for our second webinar of 2020. I'm Kevin Cutter, a Cybersecurity and Compliance Advisor for Tevora. Leading us in today's presentation is Christina Whiting, Principal of PERC, Privacy, Enterprise Risk, and Cybersecurity Framework Compliance, O'Brien Goriel, Information Security and Privacy Consultant, and Adoriel Bethishu, Information Security and Privacy Analyst. As we get started, know you can ask questions throughout our privacy team's webinar. Your questions will be answered as we transition into different topics. Historically, we find questions from your fellow information security professionals greatly benefit others and tend to generate new questions that apply to everyone. Don't hesitate to ask any and everything privacy facing. With that said, Christina Whiting is going to give an overview of what we'll be covering today.
Absolutely, thank you, Kevin. So really, there's a couple of key objectives that we want to accomplish on this webinar for everyone today. One is to really introduce and understand the role of data governance and really how does that factor into privacy programs and creating privacy programs. Best practices for choosing a framework, and that's a framework for both data governance and for privacy and how they interrelate. Defining roles and responsibilities, both within the organization and outside of the organization. And then factoring in international laws that will lead the way for future legislation and how that directly affects how you build your privacy program overall. And so as Kevin mentioned, we're going to be doing Q&A throughout. So we'll pause at major breakaways so that we can go ahead and answer relevant questions as the topics arise. So feel free within the chat window to pose any kind of questions as they come up, and we'll go ahead and monitor that queue. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to O'Brien to go ahead and start with data governance.
Awesome. Thanks, Christina. So the question we all get asked here today is, like, what is data governance? And for those of you that are new to the topic, data governance is the authority and control over the management of data assets. It is essentially compiling all the processes that help ensure the proper management of data assets within an organization. An effective data governance program assists organizations in integrating a process to ensure the data lifecycle meets specific standards and policies. Security data by defining who has access. So to break it down, it's really just building out like a lifecycle of the data, understanding the data internally, building out that lifecycle associated with those data sets, and aligning it to specific policies and standards that are outlined internally, such as like a classification levels. In the next slides, we'll dive deeper into specifics of the actual program itself. Cool. So what are the benefits of data governance? So it gives you data transparency and provides metrics and measurements for the program. So under data transparency, the governance plan created allows for reliable interpretation of data usage through consistency. It allows for prioritization and decision-making by providing you a clear direction for how to manage the data. It improves the overall data quality, accuracy, and availability to stakeholders. It assists with managing security and compliance risks by applying consistent data usage, and principles across the organization. Underneath metrics and measurements, it allows for better analytics, provides quantitative and qualitative metrics against business outcomes. It provides a stronger compliance program to monitor and evaluate data resources, and it provides real-life use case scenarios for forecasting. So to sum it all up, as a whole, the data governance is providing quality, usable data combined with analytics that allows the organization to make concise decisions based on metrics for real-life use case scenarios. So what are some successful data governance strategies? There's seven key metrics for a good data governance strategy. Starting off with the first, the where. So where is the data being stored? Is it in a co-location? Is it in a data warehouse? Is it within the cloud environment? Really just capturing and understanding the different data locations. And then going to the who. So who has or should have access to the data? So evaluating the business and each of their data access. So like, for example, marketing, business, intelligence, sales, what do they have access to and why do they need that access? What is the data type? So are you guys handling consumer data? Is it vendor data, employee data? Really just identifying those data sets. What is the data environment currently structured? So is there a specific process in place? Do you guys have unstructured? Is it structured data? What does that really look like? And then the quality is really defining the desired quality, but also analyzing what the current quality is and where you guys want to lead to and what you guys want to get to at the end of the day. And that leads us into the goals. So what are the goals you want to achieve with the data? Is it the focus of internal or is it internal or external facing? So you look to is it looking to generate more sales or drive metrics around improving specific internal processes? And then from there, you'll get to the requirements. So you'll start breaking, once you have the goals in place, you'll break out the requirements and actually define a clear outline of the program and where you want to head towards with the outcomes. So underneath the program, you need to define some key roles and responsibilities. Starting from the top down, more of the executive management role. This is a strategic role. Creating the data governance council. This role provides vision. It provides leadership. And it should really include representatives from the different business units. That way, you can capture the full breadth of the overall organization. Going to the tactical, you have data stewards. So again, it's a tactical role. They assist with implementing specific principles, policies, standards, procedures. They also have the essential. Their essential responsibility is to ensure that data is stored within the data field. Those data within the data fields are exactly what those need to be. Data custodian is another role that's responsible for the technical environment of the data-based structure. And then you have the operational, which is the data consumer. So again, it's operational role. If they're part of the workforce and they assist with awareness and execution.
So Brian, where does the start or the catalyst for data governance typically start in an organization? Like, who usually brings it to the forefront and is like, we need a data governance program? Is it with the executive team? Is it as a driver for privacy? So does privacy, really start the catalyst for creating these data governance programs?
Yeah, definitely. It fits right with there. So this kind of fits hand in hand with the privacy program. Just because privacy is securing the actual data sets and the data environment. And so creating and kind of leveraging this program itself, bring it up to executives, getting them on board with assisting and just leveraging this program as a whole to overall govern the data sets for the privacy program.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we're really seeing here is when we say critical roles for data governance council, data stewards, data custodians, data consumers. So the data governance council, it doesn't have to be its own council. It can be a component of or a subcommittee of a privacy council and committee. So it's really changes up depending upon the size of the organization and the type of organization that you are, because of the fact that, a much larger organization may have this separated because they might have, terabytes and petabytes of data that they have to manage across maybe, 30, 50 different business lines that are really interacting with it. So it's going to be a very complex environment. Versus, a startup or a, small, medium-sized business where data governance is going to be a foundational component of a privacy program. Therefore, you're not going to see separate roles accounted for this. In addition, data stewards and data custodians could be, business owners product owners, they could be the data scientists, they could be the database administrators. So we're really seeing these functions and these roles, as O'Brien has described them, really embedded into existing capabilities that an organization already has in place in order to go ahead and field test a lot of this stuff out, making sure that, where should it sit in the organization, really how do we fine tune these responsibilities, what should this really look like based on the culture and the activities that we're doing as part of the organization. So just wanted to, interject there and say, food for thought. It's not a one-stop shop when it comes to when you look at these types of roles, and you'll see this across all the frameworks. You don't have to have a role that specifically is 100% dedicated to, a data custodian or a data steward. It can be embedded into existing roles and responsibilities that are already defined in the organization. The key is to understand the underlying concepts that these are supposed to cover so that you can truly embed it in.
So jumping into data governance frameworks, there's actually some frameworks out there that will help guide data governance initiatives. Starting off with one of the core one that actually provides a good infrastructure and establishes the program itself is ISO 38500. This guidance actually breaks down very nicely, breaks out some of the roles, responsibilities, discusses the data lifecycle, even the data usefulness lifecycle, and really assists organizations to help drive that program internally. And then you can go into the NIST privacy framework. So the NIST privacy framework is a good measurement for a full privacy program, and it includes data governance. It also helps measure where you guys currently sit as far as data governance is concerned. And so does COVID-5. COVID-5 breaks down the measurement aspect of the program itself, and provides a good coverage on the data lifecycle and what that should look like for the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we look at the level of complexity associated with each one of these frameworks and how to adopt it within an organization, like any framework, and this specifically relates to data governance, you can't just take the framework and say, this is going to fit 100% of all of my needs, and or 100% of the framework will apply to you. So it's really about customizing what works for you and what is unique about the organization, what you're doing with the data, and how it's necessarily being handled. So for instance, COVID-5 tends to be a bit complicated to understand and apply within an organization. Very similar to, I'm sure most of you are aware of, COVID-5's, security controls and the security control framework, and how to build out, a risk program or a general computing control environment, et cetera. I mean, the same rules apply when it comes to the data governance sections. And then with the NIST, privacy framework, there's an entire, domain associated with data governance that really starts to break it out and starts to give some insight into the expectations that organization and privacy laws really do have when it comes to the fundamental aspect of how data is protected, handled, moved, et cetera, i.e. governance. What's interesting, and it's actually been around for a while, is the ISO 38500. There's actually a part 1 and a part 2. So if you do look up the framework, there are 2 parts to it. Unfortunately, they are sold separately. They don't get bundled together. And the 2 really do relate to each other. One is on infrastructure, and the other one's specific around data governance and that overarching framework for data governance. But the 2 are really integral within each other and have a lot of synergies between themselves, which, help provide a holistic strategy for data governance. What we're seeing today is, applying a lot of the fundamental concepts associated with 38500 allows an organization to really catalyst their data governance program to the next level and start to establish a key set of, basic parameters around what do my policies need to look like, what do my standards need to look like, what are the critical components that should be discussed within my data governance committee or within any other committee that's, talking to data governance. And really the new kid on the block is the, NIST privacy framework. Obviously, that was just released about a month ago. And so people are still digesting, what is it about? How do I integrate it? What does this really mean? Of which Adorial is actually going to go over and do a deep dive into it, on the second half of our webinar. But there's definitely critical components associated in there when it comes to data governance. And this is really, really insight into the importance on how data and the thought of data needs to be separated out from general security controls, from general privacy controls. And so as we see these frameworks get modified, updated, or brand new ones come out, we start to see a lot more of a breakout of data being handled separately instead of just being embedded into the general controls themselves. Cool.
Awesome. So data lifecycle, aka data use in its lifecycle. So pictured here, you have like the ISO framework, walking through the data lifecycle or example of the data lifecycle. You also have the COVID one as well. So by launch of the governance program, the program should align to some sort of data lifecycle, and that's kind of like customized for the organization, and really calls through some of the key data sets. So for example, it starts off with the create, where customers, they purchase a product, let's say from an online store. Their information gets stored, in a clearly defined database, whether it be external or internal, on the cloud, wherever the database may be. But it's defined. And then the order gets processed and entered into the company's data repositories, accessible for reporting and providing for metrics. And at some point, if interactions deplete, it will get archived because the data is no longer useful. And then eventually, once it hits a defined period, again, it's defined internally per policies and procedures. But once it hits that end of life, it'll get purged from the environments and continue. The lifecycle will just continue on.
Cool. So, when we look at, we call it a usefulness lifecycle, because different types of data have different use cases and scenarios, as O'Brien was mentioning. And so, a great example of this is, one example would be marketing data. So marketing data, as you are preparing a campaign, a new product set, what have you, all of that could be considered, like as it's created, as it's stored, and as it's processed, it could be considered, confidential information because it's not yet publicly available, or the campaigns or the products haven't been launched yet. So you start to see a series of controls and privacy around that set of data within that cycle of it. But as soon as it gets released and those campaigns are released and the marketing campaigns are out there and everybody sees the logos, what have you, it starts to take on, it's no longer confidential, because it's now become public information. And while the key critical files behind it, so like, the raw images of the logos, maybe specifications around the product itself, would remain confidential, a lot of the advertisement associated with it is now public information. And so the privacy and security controls that you've designed around it can essentially be loosened or dropped off. So it has a different usefulness depending upon the cycle that the data is in. And that is absolutely something critical that needs to be evaluated as part of the program, so that you can create these, divergent processes that look at the workflow of the data and where am I in that particular time period of that workflow. So that way you're not overly implementing security and privacy controls for data that is public information, which in essence could, cause you additional money, additional resource, and add complexity to the overall process.
So intersection of privacy and data governance controls. So starting off with data governance, this is the management of data sets. It's the overall governance of the internal data the internal data stored by the organization. IT governance is in place to kind of help govern those data sets, so help secure and protect those those repositories. And in return, compliance, it's upholding you to any kind of regulations, whether it be privacy or, PCI, whatever compliance regulations you have to abide by internally. And really data governance sits right there in between all those with the data privacy and confidentiality controls in place. I like to look at this as almost like, there's an analogy that I like to kind of say for the relations between data governance and privacy is, privacy is almost like a pipeline, and you have the data governance is the water that flows through those pipelines. So having a structured pipeline allows for the data to flow more fluidly.
Cool. So we're going to open it up to general questions around data governance as a whole, about any of the frameworks, any of the processes, the roles and responsibilities, how does this fit in? So we're going to go to the queue and look at any particular questions that have arisen as O'Brien was going over information.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. It looks like we have a few. So one of the first ones that popped up around this was, why should my organization care to build a data governance program?
Yeah, absolutely. So in order for a company to profit, you must collect data and create any kind of leads or just do internal analytics to help drive the business and the technology forward. So if you collect data, if you collect user data, you're required by privacy laws to protect and manage this data. So by creating and implementing a data governance program, you're ensuring that all entities of the organization are upholding to these regulations.
Good answer, O'Brien. Next question that we had was, how do I convince stakeholders to invest in this program?
Do you want me to take that one? I'll take that one. So when you look at, how do you convince, it's really around the value. So it always comes down to what is the value proposition of any kind of program or any kind of need that you're requesting budget and or resources for. And with this, you can think of data governance as that foundational level when it comes to building privacy programs. How do you build a privacy program and comply with the particular regulations globally if you don't know how your data is being used, if you don't know where it's going, if you don't know where it's being shared, with external parties or internal parties? Because if you don't know where it is and how it's being used, how do you secure it? How do you know where particular consumers' information is located in order to comply with data subject access requests as it goes through its life cycle? How do you know where to delete it because you're not necessarily sure where it's stored? So you start to build out this value proposition and this nested ecosystem that says, data governance, feeds into so many different programs. It feeds into your privacy program and ability to comply. It feeds into any other compliance or regulatory requirements that you also may have. And in addition, obviously, there's a lot of organizations that are looking into data science and data analytics. It's always about the data. It's in the term. So if you don't know where your data is, how often it needs to be refreshed, what is its usefulness life cycle, how do you know that you have accurate data in order to build analytics off of and or new products that you're looking at using machine learning or artificial intelligence? Because the data has to be accurate. It has to have integrity. And so the data governance program is truly the foundation to all of those key components in order to be successful. So when you look at, how do you get it funded? Where does the investment come from? It really comes from building that story, building the synergy between multiple departments and the strategic initiatives of the organization. And looking at it from that perspective, it takes, one person to make that call. It takes, another person to own responsibility to say they're going to move this forward. And it's really looking around the organization of who is that best fit in order to bring this forth and get investment to make it happen.
Great answer, Christina. And we had one additional question around data. There's always a question for us on who owns the data. If we are conducting surveys as a service to a customer, does the customer own the data or the entity that is collecting and reporting on the data?
So the ownership would be defined in your contract with your customer itself. So as you're doing surveys, it's interesting. So you're being contracted in order to, send out surveys. but you're being paid to collect that information on behalf of another organization. So it depends on how you are collecting that information. Are you in stealth mode, meaning it looks like it's your customer that is directly collecting this information, or are you being seen as an independent third party? So those terms and conditions are always defined within the contract itself, because it could potentially go either way. And if it is not defined within your contract, this is where, when O'Brien was discussing roles and responsibilities, those roles and responsibilities need to be defined after the fact within a roles and responsibility matrix to say at what point does ownership change for this information, because it can change depending upon what's taking place. So maybe initial capture, you could potentially own, but then when it's transferred over to your customer, because they're the one that paid for the service, then they own it and you've released control and you've released liability. So you look at the indemnification language, the liability language, and the customer contract and commitment around data within your contracts. Usually we'll call out and spell that out. And so the legal teams will usually, hone in on those types of aspects, because it's all about releasing liability from yourself.
And then a fourth question that came across: how are CCPA and GDPR changing the needs for data governance and privacy program requirements?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is really bringing to the forefront the need for data governance programs. All the privacy laws started with GDPR, goes to CCPA. Obviously, we have a lot of other ones within Canada, India, China, Australia, the list goes on and on and on, even New York Shield. And so what's happening is, as part of, GDPR, it was the data mapping exercises everybody was going through. And as everybody was going through these data mapping exercises, it became this static document that soon lost relevance, and yet was so vital to organizations' programs in order for them to build their privacy processes. And so over the last year and a half, that's why you've seen the terminology around data mapping change to data governance. So it's not like data mapping is a component of data governance, but it is not the end all be all. And so this CCPA and GDPR have really catapulted the need for data governance within privacy programs themselves. Cool. With that, any other questions that do come up, we can either answer them at the end or feel free and email us after. But I want to be cognizant of everybody's time and transition over to Adorial to go over, really privacy and those privacy programs and frameworks.
Cool. So so starting at the highest point of why a framework. So we recommend building out a framework because, similar to any security or compliance requirements you're doing, you need some sort of standard documentation that you would want to build everything against, NIST or ISO or whatever for your cybersecurity requirements. The same is true for privacy, because there is complementary controls to those security requirements that a privacy framework will build out for you. So looking at the main graph right here of all of this red, this is privacy laws by U.S. state. The frameworks that we're going to talk about are built off of this, but predominantly off of GDPR, and from there a little bit of revisions for CCPA or for New York or for whoever has specifics. You are definitely going to see a lot more green in this graph in the future as privacy laws in the U.S. start to standardize, as we start to see more controls being enforced. A lot of these laws are probably pre-GDPR, if any. So moving on from there, you probably see way more green in the next coming years, and even as CCPA gets amended. So as far as building out what you guys need to do for your own organization, the first thing, similar to how you would build out a security program, is understanding your obligations. Just like if you were handling credit cards, you would understand your PCI obligations. If you're handling personal information, you understand your privacy requirements. And the big thing for privacy requirements is understanding where you are in scope for. So you have to ask yourself, are we soliciting business in Japan and Australia and the EU? These things bring up, each one of them brings up new questions of new laws that are in place. And again, if you are soliciting business in any different country, it's always worth it to check what privacy requirements are in scope. You want to understand risk, because once you know your obligations, you need to know where are you currently. So a risk assessment, maybe in conjunction with any security assessments that you're doing, a risk assessment to look at your current controls and say these are sufficient or insufficient to meet privacy requirements. You want to document everything. So we typically see a lot of, for companies that are starting out in their first few years of privacy compliance, we see a lot of ad hoc kind of operations, which you want to avoid because that leads to shortcuts, and the shortcuts leads to insecure data handling, insecure user practices. These are all things that kind of like what O'Brien was saying, of centralizing where your information is. The lack of documentation, the lack of central enforcement is going to negate that. You're going to see information spewing all over the place to different email servers, to different services all over. So you want to document everything. You want to understand the resources needed, because this is definitely a labor-intensive task. So similar to what you would allocate to meet PCI compliance, for example, you would also need to allocate to meet data subject requests, to meet encryption requirements. And from there, you want to move to assigning responsibility. So privacy isn't GDPR requires a DPO, for example, but the DPO isn't the sole authority on privacy in the organization. They're more of a consulting type. They look at all your operations, your products, whatever you're doing, and they tell you what do you need to do to be in compliant. But the actual day-to-day of building out and managing and securing privacy requirements is an organization-wide thing. So you want to assign responsibility to make sure that everybody, all the teams that are collecting information, for example, marketing is a big one that we see. Marketing is collecting the least possible information that they need. You want to make sure that developers know that functionality has to always be in favor, default functionality has to be in favor of privacy requirements, so that, by default, a product that you release in the EU, geo-tracking is turned off, for example. Any kind of unnecessary collection is turned off. The same is true for, as you move on to the training phase, the same is true for your general staff, because that's where the information that you collect is going to be processed and some sort. It's going to be going to different teams so they can run analytics, so they can do whatever they need to do with it. You want to make sure that your staff knows what are the best practices for handling data on the inside. So you're going to be training them not to send things over email. You're going to be training them to use encrypted mediums for data storage and data handling. And these are all things that, if you can get it down to the person-by-person level, you've really ingrained privacy into your organization. You're going to see yourself in a much better place as the years come and requirements only grow. Then we move on to program documentation. So phase 3 is more documenting specifics of your security and privacy operations, but your overall privacy program should be documented so that the first steps and everything afterwards, that can all be in a kind of one-stop shop that you guys can use against for your yearly reviews. The reason this isn't in phase 1 is because you would be building out your program, and then once you understand what you really need, what your requirements are, what you can realistically and feasibly do, then you can document everything and say, this is where we arrived. And then you want to deploy. You want to deploy any solutions that you have. You want to deploy material, trainings, everything that you have. You want to send it out. You want to, from there, begin monitoring. The monitoring phase is meetings. You want to do impact assessments, interviews with teams. You want to see what's working, what's not working. It's definitely important to make sure that teams have what they need to actually meet all these requirements. If you're putting all the money into training your employees to not send information over email, but they don't have any other way to do it, then what's the point? So you want to actually monitor and interview your staff and say, what can we do to make all of this easier for you guys? And then you want to also understand third-party responsibilities, because under most privacy laws, third parties should be considered as any third party that's handling your information would be considered an extension of your organization. So the controls that you're implementing on the inside, you also need to an extent, send down the river and make sure that they're complying with it. And that's also true for data subject requests, which is the main reason that you want to make sure that third parties have a similar privacy posture. Because if you get a data subject request, it has to go down the ladder to anybody else that has the same information. And then annually, you want to do continuous reviews. You want to treat your privacy framework as it's a living document. You want to do key performance, key risk indicators. You want to assess everything. You want to see what can be updated. You want to do this annually. You want to do it with as many teams as you can to get as much insight as you can. You'll get a lot of good information. You'll only streamline things. As the years come, you'll be in a much better place with a program that's better suited for your organization. So I mean, with that, we have, thankfully, at this point, there's plenty of publicly available frameworks to use that would save a good amount of time. But again, the steps in the previous slide are more so for tailoring what you really need, so you aren't expending any additional resources.
Right, so you're setting expectations to say, here's what my framework should encompass. Now let me look at the industry standards out there to see which one fits me the best.
Yeah, exactly. Because, I mean, you'll notice anybody that's read through these laws know that there's a lot of ambiguity in as far as how you implement stuff, and that's the question that we usually get is, how do I actually do this? And I think that was on purpose, because every company would be doing things differently as far as what they need to do. You know, a company on Fortune 500 company has different controls than a company that only has 2 or 3 offices, but they still need to meet the same requirements. That just the approach to get there could be different. That being said, moving on to the NIST privacy framework, which is the newest of the 3 that we're going to be looking at. So we're starting out with this one because I feel that this one is very well built out for a starting phase, because it walks through privacy risk management as a first step. So it provides common language for understanding and managing everything from the high level, from the internal level. It also takes into question the ethical implications of privacy. Of this is all being done so that we're handling user data in a not only legal and secure manner, but in an ethical way. So that's a big consideration of the privacy framework. Something that's good for anybody that wants to use the privacy framework is that it's built off of the cybersecurity framework, which is used by the vast majority of organizations as a kind of secondary compliance framework in conjunction with HITRUST or PCI or whatever they're doing. So there's 3 main domains for the risk side on the privacy framework is the core, the profile, implementation. So from the core side, you're talking about what are the privacy protection activities and that you would see throughout your organization. Profile is taking what you currently have and kind of building out your profile of understanding where is our company currently. And implementation is, as it says, what do you, after doing everything, after doing your risk assessments and everything, how can we actually implement everything? So with that said, moving on to the next slide. And so going back again, they do take a risk-based approach to privacy of constantly reviewing what you currently have. And and thankfully, because it's mapped to the cybersecurity framework, you can use that overlap to do risk and privacy assessments. And you'll probably get similar results, but you'll also notice that there is a difference in cybersecurity and privacy risks on the framework. So for example, as a definition, they define a privacy risk as being a risk that arises from any sort of data processing. The cybersecurity risk side is, let's say, firewall management. You're doing something wrong there. That's something that would be in PCI, under HITRUST, under various cybersecurity frameworks. But CCPA might not really talk you down for not following best practices for firewall management. But on the inverse side, you could be processing something in an insecure manner. Let's say you're processing credit card information in a manner compliant with PCI, but it might not meet the processing requirements of CCPA. So that would be a privacy risk because it's something that's specific to your privacy requirements. So they consider, so CCPA, looking at the graph at the bottom, or the diagram at the bottom, they define everything as a process, a problem being a risk that arises from the data processing activity. The individual would experience the direct impact of this. Again, this ties back into the ethical. So that would be any kind of embarrassment, economic loss. You know, a company that was handling very sensitive information, if their stuff is leaked, that's a big deal for whoever's out there. I mean, to give kind of a bad example, if you remember, I think it was Ashley Madison had a leak a while ago, and that was God knows how many names got out, and that was very sensitive stuff to be leaked in a breach. The privacy framework takes that into mind that not everything that goes on online needs to be publicly available. You need to take into account that these are people that they're going to experience embarrassment, discrimination. They could lose their job. All these things could be tied back to the company if they decide to come back and sue and say, look what your insufficient security posture did to my life. And then once the individual experiences it, the organization will experience it, because then you're not only in violation of privacy requirements, but your reputation's hurt, operations are down, financial losses. People would probably not want to be, they just choose a competitor and say, oh, these guys had a breach, I'll just go to XYZ company instead. So for the risk-based approach to privacy, and as just another definition, they define a data action as being a specific, kind of the one-time processing, and the processing and data processing itself is the collective set of actions. So the data action could be, let's say, running someone's credit card number. You're doing it once. The processing is that whole process of we're running 1 million credit card numbers for a specific designed purpose. Moving on to the next slide. So yeah, and again, going into the risk side, the privacy framework kind of walks through from the start to the end, and tying into the cybersecurity framework of what organizations need to do to manage their privacy risk. So organizations need to find the balance between security and privacy and efficiency. Because one thing that these frameworks, these laws all take into account is that they expect you to still do business. They know that you still need to do business, that you can't shell out all the money in the world to meet security and privacy requirements. So like Christina was saying, it does talk a lot about realistically setting expectations, and from there you can build out something that works better for you, rather than just kind of doing a one-size-fits-all and spending way more than you need to, and maybe not even securing yourself because an enterprise solution might not work for a smaller company. So there's four tiers in the privacy framework, just to walk through really fast. For risk management, there's the partial tier, which is where on the intro stages of the risk informed, as in your organization knows where everything is at. The repeatable would be kind of on the way to acceptance of, do we expect this sort of thing to happen again? Is this kind of a cultural thing? Could this risk arise in a new processing activity? And then adaptive is taking all that acceptance, adapting it, and working out some sort of solution to address the risk. So if you look at the graph at the bottom, the identify, govern, control, communicate, protect, again, maps very closely to the CSF, and there's just like one or two differences, I think, just in governance. But if you're using the CSF as a baseline for your organization, implementing the privacy framework is not that much more work. So in a similar vein, moving on to the ISO 27701. So in a similar vein of how the privacy framework is built off of the CSF, 27701 is built off of 2701. So most organizations already use 2701 as a kind of a standard of just having that ISO cert to show to people and say, we meet our security requirements. Similarly, you can also just, if you're already doing ISO, it's not a ton more work to just start doing 2701 and have that extra privacy certification and saying we're proactively taking steps to meet these requirements. So 27701, similar to ISO, is designed to be, again, kind of ambiguous and kind of let you and your organization work out how you want to actually meet these controls. It works for any kind of entity that's collecting, processing information, nonprofits, public, private, Fortune 500, whatever it is. You're going to see, the language will make sense for any size of organization. One good thing about ISO that I think that the privacy framework doesn't have is that ISO does get a little bit more specific, and its requirements are built out to map closer to GDPR. So if GDPR is a question for you, then ISO is probably a better bet, because NIST, despite being built by the government, it doesn't, of course, just build off of existing US laws. It takes into account current trends around the world, but by and large, it's not, the privacy framework doesn't fully map to GDPR. ISO would probably be a closer bet for that. And again, you still need to make sure that the GDPR processes are included in your ISMS. And the first step, similar to ISO, is a gap assessment. And you're going to see that, you saw that with the privacy framework. Again, the first step is to actually just take a step back and say, what are we doing now? Where can we improve? You'll probably save a lot of time by just doing that, because maybe you'll save time on controls that you don't need. So that said, with ISO, and again, ISO is high level, but moving into something even more high level is the NIMIDI framework. So the difference between NIMIDI and the main difference in NIMIDI, ISO, and NIST is that NIMIDI comes from a for-profit organization. NIMIDI sells software. They're trying to make money. Of course, the framework is awesome. This is important to keep that in mind when you're scrutinizing everything, because the NIMIDI framework isn't built out in the same sense as ISO or NIST. NIMIDI is built out as sort of, and if you look it up, it's literally just a PDF graph, several tables with a ton of questions. NIMIDI isn't built out as sort of like a framework of do this, then do this, then do this. NIMIDI is more built out in the sense of questions. Each domain will have their 20-something questions. You take those questions and you pick and choose. You see what would work for us. What are questions that we should be asking based off of different things? It's not really designed in the sense that you would go question by question in NIMIDI and actually try to hit every single one. So that being said, NIMIDI is very, very well built out and is a great, I feel, supplementary tool. But as far as building out your own framework, NIST and ISO are stronger ways to have like a baseline, and then NIMIDI is better when you're going domain by domain of different security functions and asking more questions, because you might get some information from NIMIDI that you might not get from NIST. It might come up to a new control. Maybe could lead to more efficiency. It's always worth checking. NIMIDI is neutral. It's jurisdiction and industry neutral. It's consideration based, and again, organization size is a factor for NIMIDI. Again, going back to the checklist thing, a small company, maybe they can't do everything ISO says. Maybe they can't do a yearly ISO assessment. NIMIDI is more than well enough as literally just printing it out, putting it around the office, giving it to people. Those questions alone will spark a good thoughts in their head of how to meet privacy requirements. So as far as comparison, again, because privacy frameworks, privacy laws don't have a ton of implementation language, we kind of do see a good amount of overlap in frameworks because they also don't have implementation language. To give kind of an example, PCI and HITRUST might have different requirements for password management or password storage, but there isn't that kind of technicality in these frameworks. So there's a lot of overlap. It really is about choosing it really is based off of choosing what your obligations are. And again, going back, NIST is maybe if you're already using the CSF, if your compliance requirements are just limited to privacy, maybe NIST is a good approach. If GDPR is a question, if you're already doing more restrictive compliance requirements like PCI, maybe ISO is also a good supplementary certification to have. And then from there, getting 27701 is not that much more work. So with that being said, I wanted to talk a little bit about shared controls. So one of the things that we get asked a lot is regarding our data centers who are holding customer data, our cloud providers who's holding our data for us. What's their role in it? And that's really important to establish those controls from the earliest stages. And if there's existing relationships, it's worth it to go back and try to establish those controls now. So you need to establish the responsibility matrix, so to speak, of what do the cloud providers need to do for our privacy and compliance requirements? What do we need to do? A lot of times, their requirement is literally just to protect the physical environment, and then from there, all the privacy stuff goes back to the organization to actually build up the processes of data subject request handling and data retention audits and everything. So then the inherent security controls would be handled by the cloud provider. Privacy tends to get handled by the organization, but again, establishing those controls with a data processing addendum to make sure that the cloud providers know what do we do if we get a data subject request from one of our customers. For example, AWS probably already has a ton of privacy controls in place so they can actually meet your requirements same way that you do, and they have data discovery native to a lot of their like S3 and everything has it native, I believe. But it's worth it to establish those controls in writing and say, once we get these requirements, this is what the cloud provider would do. Similarly to breach notifications. Yep.
Awesome. So, I mean, a lot of information was shared this morning and this afternoon. And so what we wanted to do was provide some relevant recent topics and articles, that we found useful in order to select a framework, see, what kind of factors are really determining what framework to choose, how to build out the programs, whether data governance or privacy. We will be supplying this deck and making it available so that way you can have these links and you can have this information. I know we're short on time, so we'll probably cover maybe 1 or 2 questions that came up as Adorial was going over information.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Christina. So the first question that came up was, by implementing one of these frameworks, how much will this cover for all applicable privacy laws applying specifically to my organization?
So it depends on the framework that you do. If you were to use ISO, for example, you're going to be hitting a lot of GDPR requirements. And what we've seen is that GDPR has more stringent requirements than most other laws in the country. I think from what we mapped out, India kind of comes close. But if you were to implement one of these frameworks, you're 80 to 90% of the way there. But again, it's about understanding your obligations. And if you're only doing business in the U.S., then maybe NIST is good enough for you. But if you are doing business around the world, you're probably going to be collecting a lot of EU data. You're probably going to be doing business in the EU. ISO is probably a better start. Once you hit everything with ISO, you do the gap assessments, you implement the controls, you're pretty much there. If you can get to a reasonable point of meeting data subject requests, you're pretty much there. So,
great.
Cool, perfect. I think for the rest of it, we'll save, if you do have additional follow-up questions and stuff, please feel free to reach out to us directly. Here's all of our email addresses if you want to screenshot that. But in the meantime, we do have a series of upcoming webinars, through June. You can check our website, or, here's the list right now covering a various set of topics across the board.
Awesome. Yeah, and for those of you that are on for us today that don't really know Tevora too well, just know that Tevora is a pure focus InfoSec management consultancy. We specialize exclusively in cybersecurity space, and we've done so for 17 years. We have 7 information security practices: cloud security compliance, threat management, data privacy, you heard from our privacy team today, of course, cybersecurity framework compliance, incident response, enterprise risk management, and solutions implementations. These practices support, in essence, several hundred IT security and compliance services. Each is overseen by a principal, such as Christina, with managing directors, practice leads, consultants, and associates that all report up the chain of command. This ensures that Tevora's 17-year methodology to InfoSec is properly adhered to. We also have a dedicated project management team. They're tasked with meeting all client-identified deadlines and requests throughout any given initiative or project. Tevora is ISO 27001 certified. We employ 100 information security professionals and have 0 contract employees. We service the entire United States, and in many cases, we trek all over the globe to support our existing international clients. We have offices in California, New York, and Virginia. We also grow organically. It's very important to us, so we're at a pace that meets the quality and expertise all of our clients have come to expect from us over the 17 years that we've been in business. So to everyone that's on the line, we really thank you for taking an hour from your busy Tuesday. Tevora, as Christina pointed out, will be hosting additional InfoSec webinars in a dedicated series over the 2020 year. So as she suggested, take a moment to check our website for additional info on these, and obviously reference the slide for any information on Tevora's webinars in general. And then know that, in essence, since we cover virtually every service in the space, we're prepared to assist any way you'd really like. Your Tevora reps are going to be reaching out over the coming days just to make sure that you receive what you were looking for from this privacy webinar. When we do, we'll address any outstanding questions that we were not able to meet during the hour timeline. So don't hesitate to ask anything of them privacy facing or on Tevora in general. So enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks again for tuning in with us.